Hello, my friends. Let's be honest with each other. If you strip away the slogans, the propaganda, and the television noise, what is happening right now between Russia and the collective West is not a mystery at all. It is the slow, painful collapse of an old imperial order that thought it could break Russia and is now discovering that it has broken itself instead. For years, the same people in Washington and Brussels told the world that Russia was finished. They promised that sanctions would crush the Russian economy, that the Russian army would collapse, that the Kremlin would fall. They told themselves that Ukraine would become the battlefield where Russia finally got cut down to size, while NATO stood proudly on the right side of history. And now the reality is brutal. They are in panic. You can hear the fear in the voices of people like John Bolton. He talks about Trump selling out Ukraine, about a turning tide, pretending that the biggest problem in this war is Trump's ego and his hunt for a Nobel Peace Prize. But the truth is much deeper and far more uncomfortable for the Western establishment. Bolton and his crowd are not guardians of American interests. They are relics of a system that still thinks you can redraw the map of Eurasia with op-eds, think tank panels, and bombing campaigns against weak countries. They understand nothing about the real balance of power, nothing about industrial capacity, nothing about what it means to wage a modern, high-intensity war against a serious opponent like Russia. They live in a fantasy world where America is always strong, Russia is always weak, and history always obeys Washington. But history has other plans. The core fact of this moment is simple. The United States and NATO do not have the means to defeat Russia in a real war on Russia's doorstep. They don't have the ammunition, they don't have the industrial base, they don't have the political will, and they certainly don't have the public support for the kind of casualties such a war would bring. What remains of U.S. superpower status rests on two pillars: an aging Navy whose dominance is no longer assured, and a nuclear deterrent that still matters but can no longer be used as a political magic wand. Everything else was an illusion. And nowhere is that illusion more obvious than in Ukraine. People like Bolton accuse Trump of betraying Ukraine. But before you can betray something, you have to value it. The uncomfortable truth is that the West never truly valued Ukraine as a country, as a people, as a civilization. It valued Ukraine as a weapon. They turned Ukraine into a battering ram pointed at Moscow. They armed it, trained it, filled its elites with fantasies of NATO membership and EU integration, pushed it into confrontation with Russia, and then acted shocked when Russia refused to allow a hostile NATO outpost on its border. They started this war. They escalated this war. They refused every realistic chance to end this war. The result? Ukraine has been sacrificed. Millions of its people have fled. Entire cities and industries are wrecked. A huge part of an entire generation of young men has been killed, maimed, or psychologically destroyed. The country has been demographically gutted, its economy turned into permanent dependency, its sovereignty sold piece by piece to Western creditors and defense contractors. The same Western politicians who did this now call themselves defenders of democracy and a rules-based order. In reality, they are war criminals, people whose decisions have killed more Ukrainians than any Russian general. They sit comfortably in Washington, London, and Brussels, lecturing the world about morality, while the country they pretended to save is bled dry on the battlefield. And all of this was done by a class of people who are, frankly, incompetent. They wear expensive suits and have impressive diplomas, but they know nothing about real war. They can quote theory, but they cannot read a map. They believe Hollywood's version of warfare. A few precision strikes, a heroic speech, and the enemy just collapses. They genuinely thought that Russia, a nuclear superpower with a massive industrial base and centuries of military experience, would fold under symbolic sanctions and Twitter hashtags. Look at the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. This was supposed to be NATO's masterpiece, the operation that proved Western training, Western tanks, and Western doctrine could smash through Russian lines and change the course of the war. It was planned by American and British officers who had never fought a peer adversary, who spent their careers bombing powerless countries from above and calling it victory. And what happened? The offensive burnt itself out against Russian defenses. Western tanks were turned into scrap metal. Ukrainian brigades were chewed up in fields and tree lines for a handful of villages that had no strategic value. Tens of thousands died for nothing. No breakthrough. No strategic gain. Just mass casualties and shattered illusions. These are not geniuses of strategy. They are performers in uniform. Products of war colleges where ideology matters more than rigor, where PowerPoint presentations matter more than serious thought. The few professionals who remain in the U.S. military know this. They run the numbers and quietly admit that in a real conventional war with Russia, the U.S. could suffer several thousand casualties a day. In 2 to 3 weeks, the total dead would equal 10 years of Vietnam. There is no political system in the West that can survive that reality. So the West falls back on what it still has: rhetoric and nuclear weapons. It hopes that words can compensate for the lack of ammunition, that press conferences can replace artillery shells, that the threat of escalation can make up for the inability to win on the ground. In Europe, this produces a special form of madness. Politicians who for decades depended on cheap Russian gas now talk about preemptive hybrid attacks on Russia as if you can frighten a nuclear power by inventing new phrases. But behind those phrases, there is nothing. No real strategy, no real capability, just fear. If they really want to know how Russia would react to a genuine attack, they do not need to guess. They can read Russia's military doctrine. Russia has been very clear. An attack on the Russian state itself will not be answered with a slow, limited operation like the one in Ukraine. It will be answered directly, decisively, and, if necessary, with nuclear force. There will be no meat grinder, no drawn-out attritional slog. There will be direct strikes on decision centers, on command nodes, on the people who ordered the attack. Russia has the means to turn much of Europe's political and military leadership into dust in less than half an hour. And that is without even touching the full nuclear arsenal. New long-range, high-precision, non-nuclear weapons are being developed and deployed, systems capable of erasing entire command structures without wiping out cities. There are no bunkers deep enough, no hiding places far enough to guarantee the survival of those who decide to cross that line. This is why so many Western elites are cracking mentally. It's not just that their predictions about Russia were wrong. It's that admitting the truth now would shatter the entire story they built their careers on. They spent decades telling their own people that Russia was weak, that NATO was untouchable, that Europe was secure. Now they are forced to watch as their narratives collapse. The Russian economy survives, the Russian army advances, and the West runs out of ammunition, money, and patience. The cognitive dissonance is unbearable. Some drown it in more propaganda. Others simply fall apart. All of this is happening while a deeper shift takes place. The end of Europe's 500-year run as the center of the world. For 5 centuries, Europe colonized, exploited, plundered. It started 2 world wars. After 1945, the United States gave Western Europe a new lease on life. Money, security, markets, protection. Europe used that time not to repair itself, but to build a comfortable illusion of moral superiority, soft power, and technocratic wisdom. Now the illusion is dissolving. Europe has no serious natural resources compared to Eurasia, no industrial base capable of sustaining modern war, armies that look good on paper but cannot fight for more than a week in real conditions, a political class that is either puppets of Washington or errand boys for global financial families. They blew up their own energy security in the name of values and green transitions. They sanctioned the country that powered their industries. They outsourced critical sectors. And now they act surprised that they are facing deindustrialization, inflation, and social unrest. And here is the key. Russia will not rescue them this time. Russia bled to defeat Napoleon. Russia bled to crush Hitler. Twice in modern history, Russia saved Europe from the monsters it created. That era is over. Moscow has made it very clear. No more Russian blood will be spilled to save European elites from the consequences of their own arrogance. If individual Europeans who still share traditional values want a future, they are welcome to come east, live in Russia, learn the language, become part of that society. Many already are. But the days when Russian soldiers died for European capitals are finished. Europe wanted confrontation with Russia. Now it has it. And there will be no cavalry charge from the east to save them when the bill comes due. While Europe and the U.S. slide into instability, something very different is happening across Eurasia. The same global capital that once saw London and New York as eternal safe havens is quietly changing its calculations. For centuries, Europe was the safe place for money. Then the United States. Now both are politically fractured, economically over-leveraged, and increasingly hostile to real industry. So where does capital go? To the places that are resource-rich, industrializing or already industrial, politically stable, willing to defend their sovereignty. Russia, China, India, the broader BRICS world. Russia in particular stands out. A country that has just defeated the combined West in a proxy war, that controls vast natural resources, that is rebuilding a powerful military-industrial complex, that is integrating into new trade and financial routes from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. This is very attractive to serious capital on Russia's terms, and those terms will not include letting foreign lobbies capture the Russian state the way they captured Washington. There will be no foreign equivalent of AIPAC running Russian politics from behind the scenes. The Constitution and the political culture forbid that. Some foreign money will be allowed in under strict conditions. The rest will be kept outside, looking in. Meanwhile, the diplomacy that actually matters is not happening in Brussels briefing rooms or at Munich conferences. It's happening in places like New Delhi, Beijing, Dubai, St. Petersburg. Look at the images from India. India's prime minister personally welcoming Putin. Warm, relaxed, confident. Those are not the pictures of an isolated Russia. They are the images of a major power locking in long-term partnerships with other major powers beyond the reach of Western tantrums. Even Trump, for all his chaos, had a brief window when he could have reshaped this picture. For 2 or 3 months at the start of his first term, he could have moved quickly to freeze the conflict trajectory, cut a serious deal with Russia, and take an off-ramp before the slide into open confrontation became irreversible. Instead, he listened to the same neocons and chicken hawks who sabotaged every attempt at cooperation. He let his own ego, his obsession with symbolic victories, and his lack of strategic discipline waste that moment. Russia, for its part, kept offering limited cooperation, particularly in the Arctic. Moscow openly proposed joint development, shared icebreaker technologies, and cooperative exploitation of enormous Arctic resources that both countries could access. But Washington's ideological reflexes killed it. We can't work with Russia, they said, and then acted stunned when Russia simply continued without them. All this time, inside Russia itself, something else has been happening. The country has grown more unified, more hardened, more clear about who it is and what it wants. The transformation of Chechnya is a perfect example. At the beginning of Putin's era, Chechnya was at war with Moscow. Today, Chechen units are among the most motivated, loyal, and effective in the Russian armed forces. They fight shoulder to shoulder with Russians, Tatars, and others. They train together, bleed together, and see each other as brothers. Stories from the front in places like Mariupol capture it perfectly. Terrified civilians trapped in basements, praying that Ukrainian forces won't throw grenades into their shelters, suddenly hearing Allahu Akbar and realizing that the Chechens have arrived not to kill them, but to protect them, to carry their children out under fire. These lived realities create a new national glue that Western analysts simply do not understand. This is why Putin's approval remains high, even according to polling centers funded by foreign interests. The Russian people see that. While the West tries to strangle their country economically and destroy it militarily, their state has not collapsed, their army has not broken, and their society has not imploded. On the contrary, Russia has adapted, reorganized, and pushed through. And this is the final uncomfortable truth for the West. NATO set out to strategically weaken Russia through Ukraine. It failed. Russia has emerged more self-sufficient, more militarily experienced, more connected to the non-Western world. The West, in trying to trap Russia, has trapped itself. In trying to isolate Russia, it has isolated its own narrative from reality. Russia is now where it wants to be, holding the territories it deemed vital, mobilized for long-term confrontation if necessary, integrated into a rising Eurasian system, and watching, as its opponents argue, panic and exhaust themselves. Western leaders can keep talking about tides turning, new offensives, preemptive hybrid strategies, and defending democracy. They can keep inventing slogans to avoid admitting defeat. But the battlefield does not care about slogans. The balance of power does not bend for speeches. Reality does not negotiate with delusion. The tragedy is that millions of Ukrainians had to suffer and die for the West to learn a lesson it could have understood on day one. You do not break Russia with sanctions, with proxies, or with fantasy maps drawn in think tanks. You can cooperate with Russia, you can respect Russia, or you can crash against it. Those are the only real choices. The West chose confrontation. It chose arrogance. It chose to believe its own propaganda. Russia did not collapse. NATO did not win. And now the same people who promised easy victory are left staring at a hard truth they never prepared their populations to face. In the struggle over Ukraine, it is not Russia that has been strategically defeated. It is the old Western order itself, watching as a new world takes shape, one in which Moscow is not a junior partner, not a supplicant, but one of the main pillars of a very different future.